All right, folks, welcome world history people to a quick overview of World War One. Now, this will necessarily leave a lot of specific information out, and I encourage you to check out other readings that I've attached and also the John Green crash course on World War One. But for our purposes, discussing whether or not nationalism caused and fueled World War One, this is going to serve a purpose of just giving you an idea of what went down during World War One. So let's take a look. You got the teams kind of set up there that eventually break out. You got the Germans and Austrians that are the primary players of the Central Powers, and you have the Triple Entente, or what becomes known as the Allied Powers in Pan there. So let's take a look. So one thing you need to be aware of is that coming out of the 19th century, most commanders were used to a different type of war. So this picture is a picture depicting the Crimean War of the 1850s, the 19th century. And if you look, you have men on horseback with sabers, maybe a few muskets and cannon, charging towards the enemy and having a clash, almost hand-to-hand combat. By the 19 teens and World War I, a very different war. World War I is a new type of war with technology, and tragically, you're going to have commanders who are schooled in the old way of maneuvering, but with deadly machinery that has catastrophic results. And we're going to take a look at that as we move along. World War I was known as the Great War as it broke out, and right after it happened, because there wasn't a second one yet. A few big things to keep in mind. Technology makes this a new type of war, much more deadly. And as I said before, commanders failed to adjust effectively with tragic, horrific consequences, almost criminal consequences for the soldiers. Now, the war begins in August of 1914. This is about a month after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Serbia. And so everyone assumes, though, because of their country is so prepared, that they'll be home by Christmas. Mom, Dad, don't worry about me. I'll see you soon. It'll be a grand adventure. And remember, at this point in history, most people who are military age had not seen an actual war. This was seen as a grand adventure. They couldn't wait. Many people were, complaining that the Europeans were getting too soft because they haven't fought a war in a while. And so there were some people that encouraged this as a way to kind of toughen up your youth. And no one really thought it would be that long or serious of a conflict. Now, skipping to the end here, it goes on until November 1918. And one way to get a scope of this is think of where you were 4 years ago. Think of how old you were, what you were doing, and how different life was and how much has gone on in those 4 years. Imagine a deadly, destructive war going on that entire time. So take a look at the map of Europe. Germany was the first country to move, and often for that reason get blamed. But if you take a look at the situation, right, you got Serbia down in the southeast portion, right? They're the ones that get blamed for the assassination. Austria-Hungary declares war on them. Russia backs up Serbia, and Germany has Austria's back. Now, because Russia's backing Serbia, this makes the Germans and Austria upset. And France vows to protect Russia because they have a military alliance, part of that alliance system. Germany, feeling surrounded, threatens to invade France. France says, bring it on. And this puts Germany in a vulnerable position. So if you take a look at the scenario here, letter A, the French will most likely focus their forces here. If you're Germany, you feel like that could be the hardest part to penetrate. And so the French are more industrialized than the Russians, and they're also bitter towards us because right about where that A is, that's the land that Germany took in 1871. So the Germans are paranoid about the French, and they see that section A there as the hardest place to go through. And so that's going to be a problem for them. If you look at section B, the Russians are going to mobilize forces in that area where B is, but most estimates of the time have them taking a long time to actually get their troops to the front because they have a very rickety railroad system. It's not very industrialized. So Germans feel like they have some time there because the Russians will be slower. Where C is, there's the Alps, so you really can't get by them. And then if you look at D and the C here, the risk for Germany there is that despite the fact that Germany was expanding their navy, the British still have a 2-to-1 naval advantage over us if you're Germany. So you got to keep these things in mind. And with this in mind, the Germans choose to initiate this plan called the Schlieffen plan, which was after one of their generals, General Alfred von Schlieffen. And it looks something like this. It has the Germans sweeping through Belgium, which they thought would be either A, letting them go through, or they'd be easy enough to invade. And they could sweep in, bypassing that section where they were afraid the French were going to be stationed, and take Paris by storm, end the war quickly, and it would be done by Christmas. And then once they've taken Paris, the Russians would be forced to give up because why bother fighting this war now? Because their key ally France is out. So if the Germans can take Paris by storm, the war will be over, and then the Russians will either be giving up or they won't be much of a problem because the French are now not a problem, and then the Germans can go get the Russians. What has to happen is Belgium either has to roll over and let the Germans go through, and the French have to pretty much lose pretty easily. This does not happen. The other thing that has to happen in order for this to work for Germany is that Russia has to actually be slow to mobilize its troops. This also does not happen. So what you have is big resistance from the Belgians and the French. So when the Germans send troops, they're blocked. They never actually make it to Paris. They get pretty close, about 50 miles outside of Paris, but they're stopped. This slows the Germans down tremendously, and this gives Russia time to actually mobilize. And what happens is that Russia, if you look over at the arrow in the red, the Russians begin to move towards Germany, which forces the German forces to split their forces in half and send some over to the Eastern Front to defend the Russians. You now have a severely weakened German military, as strong as they are, and this creates a stalemate. So because the German forces were split, this is exactly what the Germans wanted to avoid. They now have a stalemate. The Schlieffen plan fails. French and Belgium resist. The Russians mobilize faster than they expected. And this results in probably the deadliest part of the war, a stalemate where one side wins or loses. And what you have now is both sides just instead of moving and taking huge swaths of territory, they end up digging trenches and they try to dig their heels in and refuse to move. And this is the infamous trench warfare of World War I. And so from the North Sea all the way through Belgium and France, you see these lines here. You have lines of French trenches and German trenches, and they're basically lobbing bombs at each other, trying to get the other side to give up and break through their trenches. What ends up happening here is something called a war of attrition, in which the other side tries to just wear the other side down by constant bombardments and shells and explosions and mustard gas. It is an absolutely deadly scenario for the soldiers. You have enormous casualties, which we'll talk about in a minute. And what happens is you have very little strategic benefit from this because both sides are relatively evenly matched. No one is able to break through the lines. And so you have all this casualties and death and money and waste and no real change in the status of the war. It's just an image of the trench networks on the upper left-hand area where no man's land. That would be like the front trench where you'd launch your offensives, and the back rear bay is where you'd kind of have your living quarters. But we're talking in many cases they were maybe 6 feet tall. These are ditches in the ground. And you can see an image here. There's a photo of men about to go over the top to try and charge the enemy side here. They would get a whistle that would blow, and then they would all go over the top and try and conquer the enemy trench. But what was facing them were machine guns that would just mow them down as they went. We'll see some images of this later. In between the trenches were just this hollow no man's land where you'd have just corpses rotting from the last offensive, trees that were just leveled, craters. I mean, it looked like another planet. And in order to try to break the stalemate, both sides would try to pick these moments where they would build up as much military might as they have and try to bombard the bejesus out of the other side, and then hopefully disorient the enemy and take their trench. And these were often massive failures. They would have 2-3 day bombardments of just constant bombardments, and then they would try to take over. And they would try to have these big offensives to break the stalemate, and they would have no success. What you would have were some examples like the Battle of Verdun. It was the French were hoping to break through, and you had in 700,000 casualties on both sides. You had sides that were using 1 million shells a day, these launched out of the mortars. You had the Battle of the Somme, in which 60,000 a day were dying. In the end, 1 million soldiers were killed in the Battle of the Somme. So, staggering loss of life. You can see the maimed soldiers, just piles of. Here are French soldiers who are trying to take the German trench, and this individual is getting shot and falling down by a machine gun as they just spray bullets. And this is an example of the commanders using the old tactic. The enemy's territory, but they were just marching like as if they had horses and swords, but they were going up against machine guns. You have just horrific, and you can see it just destroyed the countryside, and you can hardly see the human life here. Again, this is a new type of war. The technology makes war deadlier than ever. People had not expected such destructive forces to be in. It came as a complete shock. The other areas of the war, we'll quickly go through the rest of the World War here, other fronts, not as stagnant as the Western Front in France. You In Russia, on the Eastern Front, you have the troops surprise the Germans, right? These are the ones that makes the Schlieffen plan fail. And they're important in that they divert troops from France, preventing Paris from being defeated. But the Russians face huge casualties. The Battle of Tannenberg was an example where the Germans just rolled over the Russians. It was so bad that the German commander, looking over the scene after the battle, just went into his tent and committed suicide. It was that horrible. They lost tremendous amounts of land to the Germans, and it doesn't go well for now. They fought on. The Tsar of Russia continued to be in the war because they, once you start a war, it's hard. How do you back out of a war and say, yeah, all you soldiers, you died in vain? The other thing is they wanted to control those waterways, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, so they continued to fight on. And it was literally just like throwing men at the trenches and hoping that they would, stall the Germans. Now, this is crucial, and the Allies were doing everything they possibly could to keep Russia in the war because this helps divert troops away from France and allows the French to kind of hold on to Paris. Now, what ends up happening is a revolution happens, the Russian Bolshevik Revolution, the one that becomes communist. It occurs, and the Russians eventually leave the war, sign a separate peace treaty with the Germans, and they're out in 1917. They sign a pretty brutal treaty with the Germans that signs over tons of land to the Germans, but there's little they can do. Southeastern Europe, remember the Austrian Empire, where the whole thing started. Serbia is crushed and out of the war by 1915. Italy joins the Allies because they're hoping to gain some land from Austria. If you remember the old unification of Italy story, that's still part of that in a sense. They want territory from Austria. They suffer tremendous losses as well and don't gain too much. They're seen as kind of a minor player in the big powers of Europe. Colonies in Africa and Asia get roped into this because the major European powers all own colonies, and most of the people in Africa and Asia saw World War I as a European civil war. It was the whites on whites, basically. The Allies, particularly the British and the French, overrun German colonies, and they want to use them for supply and labor and even troops on the front. And what they do is they promise freedom from their German overlords. We are here to help you, liberate you from your colonial masters. Come help and fight for freedom. And if you're a native of the colonies, how might you respond to this? On the one hand, you could say, okay, yeah, thank you for helping free us. We'll give you a hand. Others were a little more skeptical and said, well, I don't want to be replaced by a different country to rule me. The Ottoman Empire, which is the modern day Middle East, the British want to open the Ottoman waterways because they're hoping that before Russia backs out, they're hoping that they can supply Russia through the waterways here. The British try to maintain control of the Bosporus and Dardanelles. They also invade Baghdad, which is the capital of today's Iraq, and they say that they are here to liberate the Iraqis from the oppressive Ottoman Turks. Some people in Iraq buy this. Some are not so sure about this. It's similar to the storyline that the U.S. uses when we invade in 2003. We're saying we're liberating you people from your dictator, Saddam Hussein. Again, there's a repeated theme here in the Middle East that we'll come back to. The Ottoman Empire, centered in Turkey, joins the Central Powers, Germany's team, because they're trying to keep the British out. Japan gets involved. They have nothing to do with, the assassination of Archduke, but Japan at the turn of the century is modernizing itself. As we're going to talk about soon in the next couple of months here, Japan is dominated by America in the 1850s, but they kind of flip the coin and they say, look, we're going to become an industrial power too. They do, and they want to use this war as an excuse to expand their empire. So they join the Allied side, this is Britain, France, Russia, in an attempt to gain land from German colonies in Asia. So this is straight up imperialism. And the Allies are willing to take them on our team because they say, hey, look, we can use your help. So whatever you want to take from the Germans, go for it, because it's going to rob the Germans of any kind of material. The war also really plays out in the sea, in the oceans, and this is where the United States gets pulled in. The British and the Germans try to fight this war by blocking each other's ports. The British are much more successful at this, having a complete blockade on the German ports. And there's some winters in Germany where it's like near starvation conditions. The Germans counter this with U-boat submarine attacks on the British and also people who are supplying the British. And this is where America gets involved. You have the sinking of supply ships. And this becomes an issue because the U.S. is trading with England, and the British see this as an unneutral act and consider us, in many ways, a hostile party. So here comes the United States. So we vow to be a neutral power when this whole war breaks out. We care nothing about the imperial struggles of England and France and Germany. We don't care about the assassination per se. This is a European problem. However, U.S. industries are making a ton of money. We were kind of at an economic recession in 1914. This war pulls us right out of it. because the French and the British continue to order supplies, steel, all sorts of gunpowder, weapons, things that we can crank out and make a lot of money on. So we actually do pretty well. It helps our economy. Banks also lend money. England and France quickly run out of money in funding this really expensive war, and J.P. Morgan, the bank of J.P. Morgan, basically lends enormous amounts of money to the Allies. And again, this is good for banks because they get the money back with interest. So this is also very good. But how does this look to Germany? This clearly looks like we are siding with one side. Part of the reason we weren't doing any of this to Germany is because the British had an effective blockade on Germany, and we couldn't trade with them. If you look at the map here, if you look at this chart, you can see these are U.S. exports to Europe. And now 1914 there, that's the year that the war begins. If you look what happens to our exports to Germany, they virtually drop to nothing. And our exports to Britain and France go through the roof. This does not look very and so the Germans want to avoid getting us in because if we get in the war, it's going to hurt their cause. It's going to add one player against them. And so they actually put out ads in the New York Times saying, look, travelers in America don't travel on British ships here. This is in a war zone. Please take notice that this is a war going on. Stay out of here. And so, in America, by the way, we were kind of mixed here. We had a lot of immigrants, particularly Irish immigrants, who don't love the British for various reasons. We have German immigrants who have this kind of attachment to their old country. So there wasn't a strong call for war here. The industrialists and bankers, this is debatable, but many of them saw that the war was very helpful to business. And by the way, if Britain and France lose the war, they're not going to get their loans back. And so we had an interest perhaps in entering the war. It's good for business. We also had the socialist movement, which was pretty big at the time, who was saying that this war was only going to be to enrich the profits of the wealthy, and the poor are going to go off and fight. So there was actually a sizable anti-war movement before we even thought about getting involved. There was a peace movement that came out of the suffragette movement, and President Wilson at the time, he was elected on the slogan, quote, "He kept us out of war." So there's not a big strong pull for Americans to go to war. But as we do get closer to potentially getting involved, the government sets up something called the Committee on Public Information, which was essentially a propaganda wing of the government to drum up support for England and to get us ready for the possibility of going to war. The tide begins to turn in the U.S. about war with the sinking of numerous ships that kill American citizens. The Germans sink the Lusitania, the Suffolk, a couple ships, and also the Zimmerman Note, which is a note from the German government to their embassy, the German embassy in Mexico. And the note basically says, "Hey, look, Mexico, if the U.S. gets involved in this war and you join our side, we'll give you all the land you lost in the Mexican-American War, which was California, Arizona, New Mexico, maybe even Texas." And so the Mexicans never saw this, but the British intercepted it and very loudly showed us, "Hey, look, you need to get on our side here because the Germans are going to threaten you." And long story short, the U.S. declares war in 1917 on Germany. This ends the stalemate. We have fresh U.S. troops that help break the stalemate in the Western Front. The German generals sue for an armistice or a stopping of fighting. And there's a revolt, meanwhile, back in Germany that gets rid of the Kaiser and they set up a republic. And the war is over, and the Allies, essentially win this because they don't surrender. And we'll talk more about the peace process later on. But this war. So make sure you make your post. Why do you think this war was as long as it was? Why did it fail to end as quick as everyone expected?